Greetings and welcome back to room 303, and we turn now to our study of Shakespeare's classic, Midsummer Night's Dream. I want to say a few things in introduction, then I want to give a brief plot summary, then I want to work at level 2 and 3 in terms of understanding how we read this text. Now, the first thing that we want to say about Shakespeare, just to remind, I know you already know this, but let's just put this in our notes nonetheless. Shakespeare wrote 3 kinds of plays, what we call the history plays, the tragedies, and the comedies. The history plays we've spoken of already. Let's specifically now focus on Shakespeare's comedies, especially as it relates to his tragedies. You'll maybe recall that we defined tragedy using Aristotle's famous designation through his text, Poetics, where he said the following: for a great work of literature, and by the way, for Aristotle, that work of literature was the great Sophoclean play Oedipus Rex. For the great work of literature, he said, you have to have a protagonist, that actor with whom the audience most identifies as that protagonist actor character goes through a tragic fall because of a certain kind of understanding of a flaw, a hamartia. That flaw often can be hubris, right, excessive pride. And it is in the process of that protagonist falling that you then will have the audience engaging in 2 important elements of catharsis or purgation, namely fear and pity. It is witnessing that fall that allows for the protagonist, who does go from high to low, to somehow be representative then of the pain of the universe, okay? And that is to say, tragedies are not tragedies because they're sad, okay? We can have sad parts within a comedy, but rather tragedies are tragedies because of the fall of the protagonist and the experiences of purgation as it relates to fear and pity on the part of the audience. Now that's Aristotle's view of tragedy. Now we know, as scholars we know, that Aristotle had another essay that he wrote on comedy. Unfortunately, that essay, the last extant copy, was burned, as we understand it, in the Alexandrian fires. This famous library at Alexandria for the, what is that show with Nick Nolte, National Treasure? If you guys know that film at all, you know at the end when they find all that treasure, that woman is really jazzed about some scrolls that she finds? And she says, these are scrolls from the library at Alexandria. The reason why she's so jazzed is because the largest library in the ancient world was in Alexandria. All of the manuscripts were in paper papyri, and there was a fire, and all of those manuscripts just went up in a matter of minutes, and they were lost. Unfortunately, we believe, the other essay of Poetics that was written by Aristotle was a part of that fire and was lost. However, let's say 3 things about what we think Aristotle viewed comedy to be. 1, he definitely viewed comedy as lesser than tragedy, as a value to a culture. Which will maybe explain why, for example, that the Best Picture of the Year in Academy Awards is rarely a comedy. Have you noticed this? Best Picture, when the Academy Awards are handed out for Best Picture of the Year, it's rarely a comedy. It's usually something kind of dramatic and all of that. Like, why is it in our culture we place drama so much higher than comedy often? This will be Aristotle's view. Number 2, Aristotle will argue, we infer, that there will be some kind of inversion of the idea of what happens with the protagonist. In the tragedies, if the protagonist begins high, a king, a prince, somebody of high social stature, and ends low, often dead. In a comedy, we speculate, probably the inverse. Where, for example, in a comedy, you begin with some kind of a lower person, and by the end of the play, ends up a higher person. Okay? Number 3, the argument that's inferred is that comedies are the inverse of tragedies in this regards, and this is huge for our study of Shakespeare. Tragedies have a tendency to begin with unity and to end with disunity or disarray. Usually some kind of political chaos. What is it that is said at the conclusion of Romeo and Juliet? All are punished. All are punished, to the inflection of that last syllable to get that iambic pentameter gig, right? All are punished, in other words. This is chaos. You people have created a lot of chaos, is what the prince will say at the conclusion of Romeo and Juliet, right? In other words, we end with chaos, political disorder of a kind. Comedies, we infer the opposite. We begin with some kind of disunity, problem is usually the way we will say it, and then we end with some notion of unity. Okay? Now to Shakespeare. In Shakespeare's comedies, definitely we start always with some kind of silly little problem. And we go from kind of political chaos or subterfuge or some kind of problem to, in the end of the play, the great unifier. And for Shakespeare, the greatest unifier on stage can be weddings. And so we end usually in comedies with weddings. Even better if there's more than one. For example, in our play, we're going to hear Midsummer Night's Dream. We're going to see, obviously, 3 weddings. So at the end of our play, we'll have 3 weddings, okay? To show that everything has somehow been reunited, all right? Think about your date, 1595. That's the date of Midsummer Night's Dream. Also roughly the date we think when Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet is also being written. So think about the ways in which we will pair these 2 plays together for obvious reasons. But as well important for our notes, 1595 is the time we think probably Shakespeare was writing those classic sonnets in the sonnet sequence that we have spoken about elsewhere, all right? Especially, for example, that classic sonnet of love, Sonnet 116, let me not to the marriage of true minds admit impediments, love is not love which alters when an alteration finds or bends with the remover to remove. Oh no, it's ever fixed mark that looks on tempest that is never shaken. It's the star to every wandering bark whose worths are known of those might be taken. The idea that love is like the North Star, which guides everything. All right, so Shakespeare's writing those sonnets right at the same time that he's messing around with a play like Midsummer Night's Dream. Let's also say, for your notes, that it makes sense that you have in your background knowledge a little bit of Plato and the philosophy of Plato as it's derived from the dialogue Symposium. Symposium is a dialogue where Socrates and several of his drinking buddies, that's actually what symposium means, where they get together and they basically have a drinking party. And in the middle of that drinking party, they start talking about love. And in the middle of that conversation, there is a reference to a very famous Greek myth, a story about true love. And the idea is that before you're born, your soul is like a basketball, a perfect sphere. And right before you're born, your soul gets cut in half. Half of your soul goes into you, half of your soul goes into another life form that is then born into this world. Okay? Throughout your life then, your soul, which is only partial, half, is like a magnet which is being drawn to its other side. And so it's constantly longing for its soul mate. For those of you who have ever heard this language, this is where this idea comes from. Now, watch the brilliance of this idea. You can take magnets, and you probably played this when you were a child. You can invert their polarity. You can't hold them together, yes? But the moment you let go of them, they separate. The Greeks will use this word picture to explain why. It appears to be love, but then it is not love. In other words, are you ready for the tautology and the language of this Greek myth? It wasn't meant to be. If you've ever heard anyone say that about a jacked relationship, it actually derives from Plato's Symposium. They just didn't know that they knew their Plato, okay? The idea it wasn't meant to be. However, every once in a while, 2 people bumping around in the universe, 2 souls bumping around in the universe, collide, and the moment that they collide then, there will be this coming together that will bring the 2 parts of the soul together in perfect unity. Now the Greeks will argue that that can happen, but it is very rare. Why? Look how many people there are on the planet. And so the likelihood of finding your, if you will, soul mate is quite remarkably, well, how does one say it, high or low? I mean, it's not that great of odds, you see what we're saying? So in other words, the argument is, if it ever happens that you do find your soul mate, that is one of those great gifts of the gods, according, again, to Plato. Now, there's no question that Shakespeare knew this myth, and he's going to play around with this myth. But the Greeks were great about sharing a word picture like this, not just through philosophy and a dialogue, but through a word picture as well. So let's put this one in our notes. It is clear that Shakespeare knew about the story of Pyramus Thisbe. That story is foundational to understanding a whole lot of what Shakespeare thinks about true love. The Greeks played around with this game as well. It was a really famous story, wasn't it? Pyramus Thisbe live side by side, but they don't know it. They are separated by a wall. Okay, their 2 families are quite wealthy. There's a hole in the wall, a chink in the wall, and they are allowed to discourse between that. Parents don't know. That's cue for your notes. Don't know. Pyramus, of course, is very close in language to the word Pyrrhus. And Pyrrhus in Greek mythology and in Roman mythology is a very, very influential hero, namely the son of the great Achilles. It was Pyrrhus, we're told in Virgil's Aeneid, that will help to destroy the walls of Troy. Do you got me? So Pyramus is this understood to be kind of a great young man. He loves this girl, Thisbe, and they decide to run away to the woods without letting their parents know. It's a key. We call that eloping, right? And so off they go to the woods. However, Thisbe gets there first, right? And there's a lion there, and she runs away, and her veil comes off of her head. And the lion has been eating a recent kill, so he's got blood on his mouth. And he picks up her veil, and he gnaws on it for a little bit, and he lets it go. Right? Thisbe runs away. Pyramus shows up at this special place where they're going to meet, and he sees her bloody veil, and he immediately assumes that she has been killed by a ravenous lion. And because he is totally in love with Thisbe and cannot live without her, he takes his life. He stabs himself. By the way, he does this next to a bush, the blood going onto the bush, which turns the mulberry bush from white to red. Okay. Thisbe comes back. She sees that her Pyramus is dead, holding her veil that has blood on it, realizes immediately what has happened. He was misinformed, and because she can't live without her Pyramus, she as well takes her life, and so the story ends in tragedy. However, that's not necessarily how the Greeks read that story. It's important for your notes. They didn't necessarily see this as a tragedy. They saw this rather as proof that the two lovers cared for each other. That was one reading. A second reading of the story was, this is what happens when you let young people choose their own partners in love, which is why arranged marriages are such an important part of Greek culture in every culture since the Greeks until modern times. The idea of always making sure that parents keep a close eye on their children and make sure that if they are going to have some kind of a relationship, it is a relationship of which the parents will approve. Okay? Now all of this we're going to play games with, along with one final text, and that is the great Roman poem, epic poem, the Aeneid. Here we get the story of the great hero Aeneas after the fall of Troy. He will find his way down to North Africa to a place called Carthage. He will meet a drop-dead gorgeous queen without a husband named Dido. And in book 4 of the Aeneid, Aeneas falls in love with Dido. He makes promises to Dido, and then he leaves because the god Jove has told him, you're not going to marry Dido and have your kingdom here. You are the founder of the great Roman people, and there's a place called Italy, and I need you to get there. And so he leaves. His exchange with Dido, by the way, before he goes, is none too pleasant. And he says to her, I have to obey the will of the gods. And he leaves. As he is leaving, he hears a woman scream because Dido has killed herself, stabbed herself, and jumped onto her own funeral pyre. And right before she does it, she sends down a curse on her would-be lover, Aeneas. Later in the poem, in book 6 of the Aeneid, Dido is in the underworld, and Aeneas gets to visit the underworld, very much like Odysseus does in book 11 of the Odyssey. And down into the underworld Aeneas goes, and while he's there he sees this gorgeous girl. And he's like, who is that girl? She has her back turned, and when she turns to face him, it's Dido. And he says to Dido, can we please have one last conversation? And can I please apologize? And she just turns and walks away, Virgil tells us, giving him no chance to ever have a second conversation with her. Now, surely, all of these different tragic elements of love are subsumed in Shakespeare's thinking about love, and more particularly, his rendering of Romeo and Juliet and Midsummer Night's Dream. We will see these at 3A as companion texts, no question. Let's turn now to the great play of confused love. Some have called this the greatest play of sex, drugs, and rock and roll. There's no question this play was very controversial in its day because it is the play of sex, drugs, and rock and roll. No question about it. Dope figures heavily in this play, and obviously there's a whole lot of suggestions about what happens when two young people are alone in the woods, that is to say, sex. The rock and roll part has everything to do with the way that the play ends, more particularly the performance of, are you ready for this, Pyramus Thisbe at the end of the play, okay? With that in mind, we also will pay attention to a single line from this play, and I'm not going to quote lines a lot from this play with you. My assumption is you've read it. But you'll remember that there is an observation that is made in the play early on. that will factor heavily in our study of the play. The course of true love never did run smooth. In other words, why do we call it falling in love, not rising in love? And when we speak of falling in love, why do we speak of it in our giddy kind of way? I think I'm falling in love. Which is funny, because if one of you got up and walked to the back of the room, and somebody reached out and tripped you, and down you go, bam, right onto your face, one or two of us might find it humorous. You probably wouldn't find it humorous, because you were falling smack in your face on the tile of the floor. And the obvious question is, well, that's called falling, but that's painful. We normally think of falling as painful, and yet notice our language. We call it falling in love. We don't call it rising in love, we call it falling in love. There seems to be embedded within the very language itself some suggestion, it's not a good thing, it's a bad thing, or it's a confusing thing at most, right? When we turn to Midsummer Night's Dream, we're going to look at how this single line, the course of true love never did run smooth, will play a game. Now, the play, I call it a poem because it's so brilliantly constructed. The play is constructed around 4, some have called it 5, different sets of stories or understandings of groupings, okay? So let's go through them quickly. Let's summarize. Again, my assumption is you already know this. I'm just working now plot summary so I can get us to level 2 and 3, all right? First of all, right away we have the king and his soon-to-be queen, right? So we have Theseus and Hippolyta. Now Hippolyta is this famous queen of the Amazons. Theseus has fought with her and has conquered her, and his reward, his Scooby snack, is he gets to marry her. It's pretty clear at the beginning of the play, Hippolyta's not so excited about this. In fact, she's not real excited to get to this wedding thing. Theseus is doing one of these numbers like, let's go, let's go, let's go, we're ready to get married, right? And Hippolyta's like, I'm not so sure. I know it's got to happen because obviously my troops were defeated, but I'm not real pleased with this. So right away, let's put this in our notes. We have one guy really excited about the relationship, and the girl not so excited about the relationship, and yet has no choice. That's a huge point. Has no choice. Hippolyta has to marry him because she was conquered, and in battle this is the way it works out. They will soon be married. And one of the questions will be, what kind of activities will we have the night of the marriage before, obviously, the consummation, the physical consummation of the wedding? And the answer will be, we're going to have a play performed, and that will enjoin us with the actors or the players as they'll be referenced. However, Theseus is a king, and so he's got another situation he's got to deal with, and he comes from Aegis. Now, Aegis is an old man who has a daughter named Hermia, right? She's a young, beautiful girl. And he wants her to be married. And he wants to control who she's married to. Okay? She has 2 rivals. One is Demetrius, the other is Lysander. It's interesting that the father, Jesus, is very interested in Demetrius. For reasons that are not made explicitly clear, why does he like Demetrius better than he likes Lysander? It's not really clear, other than it maybe has a little bit more political position, we might say, or we might get the idea that father thinks he can control Demetrius a little bit better than he can control Lysander. Hermia, however, on the other hand, is very interested in Lysander, and they are a thing. That is to say, they are lovers. Okay? Hermia has a best friend, by the way. Her name is Helena. You can obviously see the use of the name Helen as part of our stories in the Greek tale, right? That is to say, Paris ran off with Helen, you'll remember, and supposedly started that great big war called the Trojan War, right? Helena, she is the friend of Hermia. Helena and Demetrius were one time a thing. So in other words, there was a time when they were together. But it's clear that Demetrius is the kind of guy who likes one girl and then goes for another girl. In other words, he likes the girl he cannot get. For those of you who are thinking with Romeo and Juliet in mind, that is to say, Romeo's in love with Rosaline, and then he's in love with Juliet. In other words, you got me? So when they come together at the beginning of the play, it's a very simple question for the father. I need the king, that is to say Theseus, to say to my daughter, you have to marry Demetrius, end of story. Or you can choose to go into a nunnery and swear that you will never marry and you will be celibate, no hanky-panky. Or we're going to kill you. It's the end of the story. The father is willing to have his daughter executed, then have her married with Lysander. Whoa. And the king will say to her, you better figure this out because you're pretty quick, you're going to have to make your choice. Leaving Lysander and Hermia together on stage, and it's there, of course, that we'll get that famous line, when Lysander says, this is not an issue. I have a plan, we'll fix it. The way we're going to fix this is, we will run away to the woods. Okay? The course of true love never did run smooth, but we can figure it out. We're going to the woods. don't worry, I've got this relation, we'll figure it out, we'll get married, and we'll go against your father's orders. Now obviously, let's put it in our notes, one of the obvious tensions here is youth old age, no question. The father has the authority and the power, along with the king, and both of them have told this young lady, Hermia, you will marry with Demetrius, whether you want to or not, it's got nothing to do with it. And she, with Lysander, her lover, she will say, no. Now the way she says it is not to his face, although she does try. The way she just says it is, I'm leaving, only she doesn't tell Daddy, and off they're going to go. Okay? However, before they go, they tell Helena that in fact, this is what they're doing. We are running away to the woods. And Helena, who is so desperately wanting Demetrius as her guy, will do anything to get him. And so Helena will go to Demetrius and say, Hermia and Lysander have run off to the woods. So if you are at all interested in Helena or Hermia at all, you need to go to the woods. I'll take you there. So you can kind of see what's going down, right? Helena is hoping somewhere in all of this that Demetrius will once again, finally begin to show her affection. Okay? She will do anything for Demetrius's affection. Right? She will say to him in really famous, funny lines, you can do anything you want to me. You can whip me, you can scorn me. The more you dislike me, the more I like you. Okay? And Demetrius treats her very poorly. Off to the woods, both couples go. Okay? The third group, again, the first group is Theseus, Hippolyta. The second group is Aegisthus, Hermia, Helena, Lysander, Demetrius. Call them the young lovers, if you will, along with, of course, the father, right? You got the 4 young lovers. You have a third group, and this one is the actors. Now, these are complete nobodies who are led by, in their acting troupe, this chap named Bottom. Now, of course, that's a funny name.